I have the pleasure to welcome Gretta Louws. She's a South African-born Australian artist, and she will give us a talk about what has been bothering me for many years. And there's a sentence where it goes that once you create a tool, you become the tool. And so please take it away.
So thank you very much. It's great to be here. Yeah, it was just funny, the Australian artist, not Austrian. Okay, we established that. So the title of my talk is We Are Haunted by Ourselves, Ambivalent Media and the Ghosts in Our Machine. I'm going to try to talk a little bit about my work, why I do what I do, and a little bit, I guess, about the ambivalent relationship that I have to the technology that I work with. What I'm really interested in my practice is the interrelationships between the technosphere and the biosphere. So that's all of the things that humans made in the world and all of the living systems on Earth. Another way to put that would be to say that it's about the intertwining of nature, culture, and technology. So my practice weaves several lines of investigation and inspiration together. Firstly, there's a long-standing interest in advancing technologies and their overlapping interests on culture, psychology, and environments. Secondly, it's networks, from the digital to ecosystems, networks of kinship or mycelium. I'm interested in the interconnectedness of vast living systems on Earth. So what I'm showing here, these images, is an example. It's an immersive installation called Einen riesigen Schwarm, and it's centered around a 6-channel quasi-narrative soundscape that reflects on the biological, ecological, and psychological side effects of our march towards questionable forecast technological utopias. So the work journeys into hidden parallel existences, looking at digitalization through the lens of non-human subjectivities. It's based on many years of research into jellyfish and their proliferation in our oceans, as well as fictionalized speculations on adapting ecologies in the post-Anthropocene. It encompasses case studies, as an example, where there's been numerous cases of this recorded where swarms of jellyfish have swum into coastal power plants, so nuclear power plants, for example, blocking the cooling water systems and actually shutting down the power plants. So this is one stranger than fiction sort of truth that came out of this research. Another is an example of a completely self-sustaining jellyfish that lives in contaminated waters. So, I mean, I just can't resist sharing this. So it's a jellyfish that's see-through, and in its body, it is growing, or you could say farming, an algae. And when it needs the algae to grow, it swims closer to the surface, attracting more sunlight, allowing the algae to grow, which it then feeds upon and can sort of swim back down into the depths of the water again. And this work is also exploring the webbed networks of responsibilities that connect beings in interdependent ecosystems. So through these and many other fantastical examples, as I said, the truth is often stranger than fiction. The extent of the tangled connections between the biosphere, the technosphere, and human action become manifestly evident. And what better way to investigate entanglements than through entangled methodologies? So my work as an artist is inherently hybrid. I began, well, I was just going to say I began as a digital artist, but that's probably not true. As a child, I embroidered, I painted, I drew. These were sort of the physical art-making beginnings that most of us probably go through. Then, as I began my kind of professional career, I was mostly working with digital media. But as things have kind of advanced throughout my career, and particularly there was a turning point around 2016, I began to work increasingly with my hands. I began to integrate craft methodologies into the algorithmic and digital methodologies that I was using, and sort of try to find new ways of making work that were feeding off both, or let's say bouncing between both. As Gert Lovink writes, our disenchantment with the internet is a fact, and I would say that my work exists inside the ruins of the notion of digital technologies as a positive force. So what exactly does that mean? I'm interested in the role art plays in ecologies and networks in times of wild technological so-called progress, particularly strategies of craftsmanship and handicrafts. So all of my work exists on a spectrum of the handmade to the technological mediated and machinic, and I like to blur those boundaries or incorporate contrary production strategies wherever I can. So what we're looking at here is a detail of a larger work. It's what I would call an embroidered painting. What I do to make these works is collect a large database of drawing gestures using a digital drawing tablet, which I then translate into stitchable files using open source software. And then I can use my digital embroidery machine to essentially use the threads as colored pencils and layer over the top of one another these individual patterns or sort of fragments of a drawing to create a larger shape. Here we can see that piece in an exhibition. It's the one on the right. The one on the left is a similar work. This was an exhibition at Honor Fraser Gallery in Los Angeles a few years ago. Just to give you a sense of what my work looks like out there in the wild. This is another example from a solo show at DAM Projects in Berlin called A Software for Feeling. So it incorporated multiple embroidered paintings, some video, and also some oil paintings. I think what I could say about this work is that it's trying to, in a way, or maybe not even trying to, but it does expand the definition of technology. So on the left, we have something that I think most of us would readily associate with the idea of technology, digital art, digital technology. This is actually just a GIF animation made from a series of frame-by-frame, hand digitally drawn images. And it's based on an algorithmically generated image that is also used in the artwork on the right, which is an embroidered painting. So that on the right, it's on linen, it's embroidered, and then it's oil painted, the same image. And I could say that perhaps the biggest myth that the contemporary tech industry has succeeded in establishing is the accepted definition of technology itself. So when we think about it, everything cultural was once a new technology, but today when we hear this word tech or technology, we tend to think of something that has a plug, something that potentially is algorithmic these days or has an AI component. But technologies can be material, they can be thought, they can be social, they can be electronic, and that's just naming a few. So something that I've thought about a lot in my work, and one of the earliest embroideries that I actually made was a small needlepoint cross stitch of the words "stitches were the first pixels." And it was a way, firstly, for me to kind of reconnect, I think, with methodologies of making art that were familiar to me from my childhood, but possibly also, I think, connect me to feminist and female legacies throughout my family. And I would say very clearly these days, it's taken me a few years, but that embroidery is a technology. And even further, I would say that the circles of women who have met to do needlework for centuries is also a technology. So I would say that more broadly, sometimes if I try to explain it really simply, I say that as an artist, I paint and I embroider with machines and by hand. So the painting with machines part has come relatively recently through a fellowship under the title of Embodied Agents of Contemporary Visual Arts, which I have been working on for the past year. I've been a visiting researcher at the University of Constance, and there's a robotics lab there called the E. David Robotics Lab in Oliver Deusen's visual computing department. So when I began working there, I was thinking about this idea of artificial organisms and animate machines. So the animate machine, obviously, is the robot that's doing the painting. The artificial organisms are, in this case, orchids. I'm using the motif of orchids. They are a sort of artifact, a biological artifact of the entwined relationships or the meddling that humans have done in biological systems over many, many centuries. Orchids are the largest family of flowering plants on the planet. They exist naturally everywhere from alpine regions to the tropics and the deserts. And they are also cultivated for mass production on the one hand, and also they're some of the most expensive flowers on the planet on the other. So obviously there's a whole kind of interlocking set of different factors at play there, from biology, evolution, to aesthetics, what humans find attractive and appealing over time, to cultural relationships, to also economics and technological development. So for me, this was a fitting motif to work on this series with the E. David robot. So what I conceived was a series of two series of oil paintings on canvas that integrate AI and robotic creative expression with human authorship and subjective aesthetic preferences. So both series began with an algorithmically generated image of an orchid, the same image, in fact, being processed slightly differently. And each of these two starting points was painted by the E. David robot. Then, when we had those finished canvases, I would take a photo of the canvas, submit it to an AI, and ask the AI to improve or beautify or perfect this image. And then I would take that output as the starting point for my next painting. So what we can see here is, from one of the series, the very first painting that was made by the robot, the second painting which was hand-painted by me, and then the third painting, which is the robot again attempting to recreate my painting. So there's this kind of development between the two of us, myself and the robot, and of course also the computer scientist, Michael Stroh, that I'm working with. And the idea and the process is that over the series, you could say errors or organic irregularities become part of the motif of the next flower, and there's a sort of co-creation of this techno-aesthetic that is developed. So here's some images of, or some videos of the robot in action. Generating a digital image is one thing, but materializing it in the physical world is a whole other matter. I say that because I think because of the way that the news or the sort of media is portraying both AI and robots, this can often be confused, you know? Online we see AI-generated images being referred to as AI paintings. They are not painted, they are pixels on a screen. Translating an input image into a set of brush strokes that can be executed by a robotic arm is complicated. It involves layers of algorithmic processing, from depth and color field to defining the borders of objects in the image, semantic processing. There's all kinds of different stacked algorithms involved. But the materialization of that image in paint introduces immeasurable variation and organic error. So to highlight just a couple of examples, if the paintbrush doesn't pick up enough paint when it dips into the paint containers on the side that you can see there, then when the robot tries to paint the calculated brush strokes, the color will not be delivered to the canvas, right? Or if the pressure of the paintbrush on the canvas in a previous stroke slightly bent the bristles on the brush, the next time the robot calculates, and it does have a visual feedback mechanism, by the way, it'll calculate, it'll see a small point that it wants to fill on the canvas, and it will try to fill that. And I've watched it for 15 minutes try to fill the tiniest little spot and miss every single time because the brushes are slightly tilted, the bristles are slightly tilted. So this is the level that we are sort of dealing with. And, you know, painting is a process that requires almost infinite levels of sensory input and sensitivity in feedback mechanisms, from touch to sight. You know, there's constantly decisions being made. I'm sure anybody who paints can attest to that. So kind of zooming in, I would say that this project is about working together with the robot, co-creating a techno-aesthetic, learning from each other, and also testing the veracity of technological claims around AI and robotics. And what the process has taught me is how to tell the difference between technological theatre, which, you know, you could maybe call robotic performance art, and actual robotic painting, or as it possibly should be called, robot-assisted painting. Because the idea of robotic painting can often also be misunderstood, that we think then that the robot has sort of completed the entire process from start to finish. This is a fiction. Robots need a person to stretch the canvas. They need a person to mix the color. They need a person to spray water on the paints if they dry out, and so on. So here, this is an image of me working in the lab with or parallel to the E-David, and this was part of a separate kind of collaboration that we were doing. It's a diptych, 2 paintings. On one, the robot painted the background and I painted the foreground, and on the other, the reverse. So it's an interesting kind of collaboration, but also contrast between those two things. But to kind of zoom out from that, I think what I the conclusion that I came to from doing this work was that we really must stand against the efforts of those who desire to interpret technological trends as inevitable truths. Manufactured hype becomes the roadmap for a future that very few want. And that's why it's important that we be really accurate about what the technology can actually do and what it can't do. And just out of curiosity, I entered into a little discussion with ChatGPT and found out that ChatGPT believes its own hype. So I asked ChatGPT how it would paint a painting. So it first told me what it would paint. It described, you know, in sort of very cliche, sort of quasi-poetic way, the scene that it would like to paint, the mood that it would like to create, and so on. And I said, yes, but you don't have arms, so how would you paint this painting? Then it started to, yes, well, you're right, and it started to give me a bunch of information about how it would use a robot, for example, or if I would just provide this, you know, for it. And I said, okay, so I have a robotic arm. Can you talk to the robotic arm? Oh, yes, of course I can. All I need is you know, an adapter or some kind of communication piece of software that does the communicating between me and the robotic system. And you know, you can keep asking a bunch of questions, and it will keep giving you answers that sound legitimate in a way. And it sounds simple to say, yeah, ChatGPT can talk to a robot. Of course it can. Speak to any computer scientist, though, and they will tell you that this adapter that ChatGPT longs for is the exact thing that is difficult and basically, at this stage at least, almost impossible to do, you know, or would require huge amounts of effort still to do. And I think that that was a really interesting example because it kind of gets into how, you know, the devil really is in the detail, and we need to be really careful about how we're describing these things. So I wrote an essay about this that was published recently at ArtNet. I would encourage you to read it. It's very simple, it's very straightforward. I tried to just say it like it is. and talk about the fact that, you know, I've been a media artist for quite a long time. I've been using AI in the creation of physical artworks for 10 years. And I thought that I was fairly well informed, you know, but when I started in this fellowship, I was going into the robotics lab and I realized I had no idea how well the robot can paint. Will it paint as well as me? Will it paint better? Will it be like a printer? Will it be able to adapt to multiple different styles of painting? The reality is very, very different. It is a long, involved, tedious, an interesting but challenging process. Embodiment is one of probably the biggest technological challenges that, you know, technologists are currently facing. And I think the fact that this is so unclear, you know, even to me, who I thought I was, you know, fairly up to date on this kind of subject matter, is evidence of the tech hype machine in action, right? The article on the right was published also recently. It's about, I'm not sure if you're aware, but it's recently in Austria, there's the first AI that's been accepted as an art student into an art academy. Interesting topic. I was actually in a show recently with the creators of Flynn, that AI. What I found interesting about this article and others that I've seen is the image. There is a humanoid robot holding a paintbrush, painting physically an image. This is very, very far from the truth, and yet we have the conflation right there, you know? So anybody reading that article thinks that this is what it looks like, at least to some degree, you know? They think that that's what it looks like. The reality is that this is a fully digital AI chatbot, or, you know, sort of algorithmic image generator that interacts with people, students, teachers on a screen. There is no robot involved. There is no physical manipulation of media involved. The art that is being produced is entirely digital, you know? I'm sorry if that seems like, you know, kind of nitpicking, but actually like this, the embodiment question, is where things get really sticky. So that's why I think it's important. Coming back to Rudiger's comment from the beginning, Marshall McLuhan talked about how the tools we shape us in turn. So another way to say that is that we haunt ourselves through the machines and our technologies. And as Ruth Catlow of Further Field in the UK has explained, this is totally unavoidable. We are always encapsulated within these systems that we create or participate in or co-create, or, you know, that sort of extend from the cultural legacies that we've been involved in creating. But the question that's really important is, which ghosts are we inserting into these technologies that will haunt us in the future? How are we doing that? Who is building them, and for what purposes? So Baudelaire said that the job of an artist is to be of their own time. I mean, I think that's, you know, hard to argue with. I also think that abdicating technologies to nefarious interests is also not a solution, you know. Further Field, again, has done a lot of work in terms of this idea of taking up space in technological realms in order to sort of try to anchor them in values that are more aligned with your own. But so how do we, as artists, makers, tech users, and societies, unsubscribe from these pre-proscribed futures? How do we escape the visions of technologists who don't share our values? This, I think, is the question at the heart of my really ambivalent relationship to the technologies that I use every day in my everyday life, but also especially in my art-making process. How, you know, how can we ethically use AI? How can we participate in these technological spheres without becoming part of that hype machine that I was talking about before? So obviously, I don't have a silver bullet. I don't have all the answers. But what I have kind of, the answer that I have come to for myself in my own practice is that it is about thinking with the body. It's about the integration of the body with the brain. It is about this materialization that I was talking about before. So the use of AI in my work is often invisible, just as it has become in a multitude of influential aspects of daily contemporary life. As I learned working in the E. David Robotic Painting Lab, there is a massive gulf between digital simulation and materialization. So for me, the key to interacting with technology while not completely succumbing to it lies in the materialization, thinking with the body. A technological outcome is not an artwork. It is the beginning of a physical, sensual, material process, or a step along the way. I am interested in what Ruth Catlow calls scaffolding imaginaries, so building empathetic pathways towards futures we want to inhabit. Art can be conceptual or intellectual, of course, but in these times of advancing LLMs, ideas and talking about ideas, at least those of average quality, has become cheap. I want to see the materialization. Reuniting the brain and the body has become a central motivation in my work. And when I made that shift from predominantly digital work to a material studio practice around 10 years ago, I was thinking about learning to think with my hands, you know, the way that octopus do. So octopus have 9 brains. They have a central brain, and then they have something akin to a brain in each one of their tentacles. And those tentacles, the brains in their tentacles, can make decisions independently from the brain, even when the brain doesn't have the requisite sensory input to make those decisions. And this was something that was really kind of a guiding principle when I began working more with materials. And the fascinating thing is, and my final thought, is that the more I do that, the more I think with my hands, the deeper it becomes, and the more I realize that there is so much more to learn. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. So then I would like to open for questions. Has anyone got a question to start with? So then I would like to start. So when I said that's the thing about becoming the tool of your tool, the funny thing is that you perceived this very sinister right away, but I didn't see it as this at all. It was more of basically, if you wanna, the easiest way is like if you have a tractor and you wanna plow a field, then it's in your best interest to understand your tractor. You have to know how it works. You have to.
Sure.
So therefore, but then as soon as you have that tool, you basically generate a focus of how you do things and why you do things, and you're basically limiting your options. You're decreasing what is possible, how you do a field. Like this is why fields look squared and. Yep. And again, and so one of the things is when we started working with AI and what the potential of AI is, the more I see, the more it gets kind of boring. Totally. And because it's actually very unimaginative. And so how do you deal with that? Is there more surprising? Because it just seems we're achieving perfection, but perfection is not what's interesting.
Totally. Yeah, so when I began working with AI in my artwork, it was a lot more interesting, and I completely agree that as it's become better, i.e. producing more realistic outcomes, it's actually become a lot less interesting as an artistic medium, for me at least. Like what I found interesting was the hallucinations, the way that it would come up with things that I would never come up with because they don't exist in my world, you know, particularly all kinds of glitches, something, you know, I guess it's probably part of the scene that I came out of that's interesting to me, you know, but those artifacts of the digital process are what made it interesting for me. So when I'm using AI now, in the the collaboration with the David, I am using one of those more perfecting AI generating image, AI generators. And there it is quite useful because it gets at something interesting about the way that AI can actually never imagine an edge case. It can only ever give you the average. So as I said, orchids are this massive and totally fascinating family of plants. The forms that exist in the orchid family are wild, out of this world. And yet if you ask any AI, and I have tried hard to, using all kinds of different keyword prompts, I've even used, names of specific rare orchids, and it will still always give you something that looks like something in a supermarket. And that is because those are so predominant. They're dominant. They exist far more frequently in the world. And I think there is something that, that is interesting about reproducing that, especially through oil painting and that kind of tie back to the kind of classical tradition of floral paintings and so on in art history. But otherwise in my work, how I use AI is kind of as a snake eating its own tail. So I have a really large collection of images that I've made with AIs over a long period of time, and I use photographs of my own work and so on, and then I tend to feed those back into an AI, image generator so that I'm always getting outputs that look like my work or become more like my work, or there's this kind of like growing together process that happens. But I mean, the point that you raise about the fact that it's getting more boring is really relevant. And actually, I've secretly started in the studio painting and making works that don't have any of that input at all, which feels strange because I think it's, that's been part of my artistic process for a long time. But I'm so sick of that sort of image generation, and particularly I think the kind of throwaway culture that is behind it and goes along with it, and this idea that we can just sort of create anything at any moment. But actually, it's not anything at any moment. It's very tightly prescribed and actually, as you say, really boring.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I don't know much about art, but I'm curious because your title, it's like we're haunting ourselves, right? And then I was looking at this robot, the way it's holding the brush, and then I was thinking about Jackson Pollock or other ways of painting or draw. I cannot draw. I think I hold a brush maybe 2 times in my life. But I find this kind of very constrained and limiting.
The way that it's holding the brush?
To explore robotics in this very limited and constrained way. Is this something that you were trying to model yourself, the way you draw with the brush, or explore robotics and robot-assisted painting, which in my mind would mean including blowing up the place? Like, why use a brush? Why not just explore the whole space? So, and because of the title of the talk, I thought that maybe this is some kind of materializing for some sort of a digital process yourself or part of your creative process, and harvest the purely physical imperfection of the process, which I understand.
Totally. So this is an existing project that existed before I joined the team. So that's just to get that out of the way, that they had already started this research, right? I think that there's definitely a haunting going on, that we try to make the robot paint like us because that's what seems logical, right?
Not to me.
In some ways, yeah. Like the people there that are working on it in Konstanz at the uni, they are focused at the moment on trying to achieve that goal. And there are reasons for that. There are visual computing research processes that they're involved in that have to do with how you break down a digital input image into different color fields and how you group those together and how you would calculate the brush strokes and many questions like that, right? I think that they would really like to achieve even just a kind of competent human-style painting with this first. But I had the same question, and with many of my colleagues, I've been speaking about it. You know, like, should we use a robot to try to paint like a human, or should we use a robot to try to paint like a robot? And if the latter, what does it mean to paint like a robot? What can a robot do? Just let me finish this thought. What can a robot do that we can't do? And so, you know, I mentioned how I work a lot with embroidery, right? What you can do by hand in embroidery cannot be recreated with a machine. And I've worked with a lot of different kinds of machines, older machines, newer machines, freehand, digital machines, and so on. What you can do with the hand is totally different. What you can do with a machine, though, like this here, for example, this is a digital drawing that I made that is then repeated again and again with the digital embroidery machine. And because the digital embroidery machine can recreate the exact same embroidery every single time, completely identically, you can do these really interesting things where you're creating gradients of color, where, you know, things become really trippy when you see them in real life, and there's a kind of three-dimensional effect. This would be impossible to recreate with the hand. So that is something that I do a lot in my textiles practice, is looking at what are the unique features of human processes and what are the unique features of the technological processes, and how can we kind of get the most out of those. And there are robot painting labs or projects that are working on doing that in a more machinic way. For example, you know, having an image that is created only through the colors, but all of the brush strokes are radially aligned to start from a single point, for example. So if you could imagine that a Van Gogh painting was not sort of following these perceived lines in the sky, but was starting from one point and every color radiated out from that. And then the actual image content is communicated only through the color. And the brush strokes would be conveying this kind of technological side of things. This is interesting too, right? Is it more interesting? I don't know, because it becomes a gimmick.
But going back to Van Gogh, there is also the effect of turpentine and the amount of absinthe he was drinking.
Always.
And his life as an artist at that moment, that we know thanks to his brother, of course. But I was thinking that you're looking for this kind of imperfection through the materialization of the digital process, the physicalization of it. And yeah, of course, but we could see this approach also back in the day as well. I mean, when people were using like Velemorne, for instance, the algorithmic, and it's of course not AI, but also this kind of very iterative approach, and also the imperfection of the machines at that moment there, yeah. So we're kind of constrained to the technological possibilities of the machine from one side. But the intent, I think, it's what, for me, it's interesting. That in this case, the intent is entirely driven by you. And
what do you mean by that?
You decide
but
to work with
how would
orchids.
You like the robot to decide?
It can't have an intent. Of course you decide. It's by definition a priori assisted in any way. And I think we are more like curators in this process, right? But then I think the artistic aspect of it, it's kind of reduced to the imperfection of the materialization of this. You know what I mean? And I think
no, I think what's happening is, again...
Just not done. Just one more sentence. And in this case, I'm going back to the beginning, holding the brush in this only one way. As I said, I maybe 2 times use a brush. But I've seen, because my brother is a painter, that he's holding in so many different ways.
Oh, now I see what you're getting at.
And then maybe just not even using the brush, using so many techniques.
Totally.
First, second. I mean, there's so many things in contemporary art I've seen online that kind of suggest a different way to use the canvas to begin with. You know, going out of the two-dimensional.
Totally. Now I get what you mean.
Action painting.
Yeah.
It's so.
Yes, but this is about, that is exactly the key. Like that's the crux of the issue. It is so hard to make the robot even do it like that. So of course, the first thing that I said is, well, if you're painting, you would as a human never hold a brush like this and drag it vertically across the canvas. You would always angle the handle in the direction of movement and so on. It gives you a much nicer line. But this requires so much sensitivity about and knowledge about where the paint is going, how it's spreading, not to mention physical articulation in the joints and sensitivity of pressure. This robot has no pressure sensor in its, so it can't. Yeah, and there's colleagues also in this fellowship in London who are working with a Franca that does have what do you call that, pressure sensitivity. And their approach is more calligraphic. So they're working predominantly actually with these kind of questions, like how do you make a line look beautiful? How do you make it look natural? It has to do with pressure, speed, and varying that speed across the arc of the line and such things. The math involved in calculating those curves is really like out of my depth. And then you're taking, I mean, so some of my colleagues, Liat Graver and Daniel Berrio, are working on exactly this, and they paint with this approach, and they're layering lines upon lines upon lines to sort of build up a painterly surface. But the focus remains on the lines, whereas Michael Stroh, that I'm working with at the University of Constance, is working more on this color field approach. So he is taking what I think art people would call a more painterly approach rather than this kind of line drawing approach. So they're very different sort of mechanisms. And, you know, I think it's that kind of thing. If they had 10,000 staff and endless resources working on this problem, sure, then they would have one that, or, you know, multiple labs that had robots with sensitivity, pressure sensitivity and so on. Of course, these things can be done, but the level of difficulty and the amount of time that is required to do it is always a limiting factor, you know?
It's slightly different, to be honest. I think that we're trying to push to this, because they're industrial robots, right? Like the KUKA and the E-Dave, or what was the name? But perhaps we need to build and design different types of robots to do, you know, maybe painting. Maybe there are certain limitations there that we cannot overcome because they're predominantly designed for the industry, not for you, for artists.
But that's the thing that's so beautiful, is to see this enormous industrial robot that would normally be standing on a conveyor belt line at a BMW factory, for example, welding. That's what they're predominantly used for, or screwing in screws or something. And to see this enormous, like really powerful, and actually kind of dangerous robot, like it's not a cobot, so it will not stop if you're in its path. It doesn't know that you're there and it will knock you out, right? So you have to be really careful working with it. And to see that robot that was built for this very repetitive task trying to paint is really fascinating. And I think that's what the article was kind of about too, was trying to kind of communicate how much working in that lab and just spending hours watching this robot attempt to paint. And as you say, like failing because it doesn't have the skills required. It taught me so much about my own embodiment and made me really think about the process of painting in a totally different way, including thinking about like, you know, well, sure, there are kind of accepted ways to paint something. There are movements that we do that feel very kind of natural and whatever, but do we have to do things that way? Like, you know, you can think about how the robot does things and maybe try to incorporate some of that into your own practice too. You know, I mean, in some ways, the kind of insensitivity of it, as a painter colleague of mine recently said, it's just, das ist einfach so geil expressiv, because it doesn't have the precision to paint in, you know, in this kind of like slightly perfectionistic way that I have of painting. So the robot, in some ways, is capable, with a lot of curation, yes, of creating lines, images, whatever, an aesthetic that has something, you know?
I think maybe that's the key, because at the end of the day, this limitation is a great opportunity. And I remember there is a very long tradition in drawing machines, like also these
Exactly.
motors, but they were also mechanical ones, which
Yeah.
I find really beautiful.
Yeah.
Like a bit steampunk kind of. But the point is that this limitation, actually, I think is an opportunity, like
Totally.
huge. But the approach is different, because I think you mentioned that, like this dot that is trying to fill. But maybe it's not only about the dot. Maybe it's about this feedback loop that you as artists have to give away a bit of the freedom, right? And maybe you don't get exactly good looking according to human, because
Totally.
I mean we consume the art at the end,
Yeah.
the audience. You don't get a orchid, but I think this feedback loop would be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing that differentiates a physical output from a digital output, because in the physical output, if you're not careful, and this is in the programming too. So, you know, one of the things that the computer scientists and I discuss a lot is the sort of the cutoff threshold. Like, how perfect do we want the robot to attempt to make the image? Because if we say we want it to be 100% filled, the chance is very high that it will, firstly, you know, crash. There'll be like singularities happening. But secondly, that it will apply so much paint because it's trying to fill every single little spot, and there's all kinds of errors happening, including things like in the visual feedback system, when the paint is wet, there might be a light reflection and it thinks that that spot is white. So then it's going to try to repaint that part. You know, these are physical kind of phenomena that you know, there's not necessarily a coding solution for, so you have to sort of take a practical solution, which is then to say to the robot, okay, give me 95%. Otherwise, it'll add so much paint that it just starts dripping down off the canvas, which we've also had before. Not necessarily bad, you know. My approach to this project was definitely like, I'm not going in there trying to create a perfect image. I'm going in there to see what the robot can do and to try to work with that, to work with the computer scientist to give him, you know, ideas about how he might start to change things, improve things. So just as an example, prior to my residency starting there, they'd almost exclusively worked either with ink or with watered down acrylic paints. Ink is just like the same consistency as water pretty much. So if you dip the brush into the receptacle, ink, as long as there's some ink in there, it will always get into the brush, right? Because it always flows in to replace whatever was removed. I am working with oil paints. Oil paints, even if you mix them with a medium, have a sort of moussey texture. You can't make them too liquid. So when the robot, which has been programmed to always do the exact same motion, the exact same pickup motion, it will go and take, let's say, 3 times the same color from the same receptacle. And after that, there's plenty of color still in, plenty of paint still in the receptacle, but the path, the exact path that it follows every single time is empty because the paint is on either side of that path. So of course, the first thing that I said was, well, we need to have some kind of randomization process that, you know, means that the brush is brought over there, it's dipped in there, and then there's a random process within the sphere, the area of this holder, you know, the color holder. Yeah, of course they agreed with me, but then, you know, who's going to program that? It's a university, there's one PhD student working on this. So then they have a student who's like bachelor project or something is to program this paint pickup motion. And then, you know, then that was nearly finished. And then the company issued an update to the sort of generalized, like, whatever it is, steering software, which meant that they would have to then completely reinstall the whole system in order to be able to reinstall this one new piece of code. So then what should have been like a medium-sized project became this massive project that was going to, you know, take 2 people's time for at least a couple of weeks to kind of get it up and running again, you know. And that is the sort of, that's why it's not that easy to just say, well, just have a pressure sensor on there. Of course you should have a pressure sensor on there. Yeah, yeah. Who's going to do it? You know, somebody has to do it. And that's a lot of work that's involved to actually make that function.
We're coming to an end. Do somebody else have a question?
A very small question. Whose idea was it originally to make the robot paint? Was it like a PhD project, or was it the idea of the university, or like a Grundlagenforschung, or like the company who wanted the robot to paint?
I believe it is a brainchild of Professor Oliver Deussen in the visual computing department, and he's just a really great, interesting computer scientist who also happens to be a hobby artist. And I think he just thought it would be cool. So there was a room free in the basement of the university, and they managed to get a second-hand industrial robot, and it's been working there ever since. And it's fascinating. I love this, you know. It's yeah, it's a really wonderful like expansion, I think, of the work that they do there. Yeah.
One more question. But then we have to stop.
I mean, I've been following your work for like 12 years, I think now, and I know like it's just like there would be beyond the scope, but I know how much other work you've left out and how broad your repertoire is, starting with online performances in the early days and so many other things. So I know kind of there's a rich repertoire of what else we could be talking for hours and hours. But the one short question I have is if there's one thing you can think of that you've learned from the robot, what would that be? Because you've been talking about collaboration, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think really the biggest one is a new appreciation for my own physical infrastructure, let's say. So when I am painting, I think very differently about that process. I find myself being grateful for all of the kind of, you know, infinitely sensitive sensory inputs that I have in my, you know,
all your 9 brains.
iOS.
10 brains.
Yeah. I think that's probably it. But then the other part of it is, of course, like what I was trying to talk about in terms of, you know, what's fact and what's fiction, you know, and I have a much better filter now when I'm reading the news or, you know, seeing things online, like that image, you know. I don't know. I probably would have thought that was AI generated prior to doing this fellowship, but I wouldn't have known how far from reality it is, you know. That's I think, something that's been really interesting. So it's kind of given me a reorientation, I would say. And I mean, then I guess also an appreciation of, I don't know, the complexity of how we put images together. Like what does an image consist of? It's not just colors. There's meaning involved. There's, you know, there's so many decisions that are being made. And I think that teaching a robot or trying to teach a robot to go through those processes and realizing how many of those things it can't do on its own, or that you have to kind of find a way to communicate, makes one more conscious of those processes that otherwise would be quite unconscious, I think. So.
Apparently the credit of the photo, it's a company, FreePic, that it's creating AI-generated stock images.
Sure, yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thank
And we're
you.
gonna